So two things I kind of want to talk about today. One is the slow burn versus the fast burn. And the other is tension versus suspense. And there isn't much to say about the slow burn versus the fast burn. I think this is something that kind of gets misunderstood. The reason I bring it up, though, is because in my last video I said that my new book, To Private Ford Rayburn, is not really a romance, but I know people are going to get confused about that because the first 100 pages entirely deals with their romance. And the reason for that is because I had to build up the motivation of these characters so the story can happen, obviously. If I didn't unveil their romance, then a lot of what drove the plot and drove their motivation would not make much sense in the later parts of the book. But that being said, I keep seeing this because this came up with my first book, The Chaos Child, where people were like, you kind of like jump into it and then slow down a little bit. And I do have that. And then I also heard the exact opposite of like, this is meandering and stuff. And I'm like, okay, you know what, people, this is pacing. This is what pacing is. And here's the problem. We don't have a lot of good pacing in stories anymore. What we tend to have is a really snappy first chapter, sometimes a snappy first 3 chapters, and then books tend to slow way the fuck down. Or you have something even worse, which is like, while a very snappy first chapter, not much happens within it. And someone who recently read The Chaos Child said along those lines of like, yeah, this first chapter, just the first section of it, could have been 3 chapters in and of itself. And they appreciated that I didn't do that, obviously. And so, slow versus fast burn, really it's a pacing issue. People, you need to work on your pacing. This rule of like the first chapter, which is what everyone reads, being the absolute best, we need to get rid of that rule, okay? Because it's really making terrible books. People are just writing a good first chapter and then disregarding the rest, because at that point you're kind of hooked. And I know I've fallen for that for a couple books I've read. I was like, oh, the first 3 chapters were so good, and oh, this is slowing. It's getting so boring. I can't do this. Yeah, but I'm kind of invested, so I guess I'll try to finish. Usually at that point, I've gotten to the point where I start skipping, if that starts to happen. And then go, yep, I really didn't need half your book. But my rule of thumb about both these things is like, it's not about fast start or slow start or whatever. It's about what is the pacing of the story. And cut the chaff. Simple as that. Get yourself a good editor, cut the chaff. I know, it's another editing thing. Sue me. 2 things I will always die on hill-wise, right? 1, Court of Thorns and Roses is the worst book I've ever read. 2, get yourself an editor, a good editor. And again, I will stress this, not your writer friend. Okay, now that I've made that point, because I know I'm going to hear it. I know I'm going to hear the like, what is with these chapters? And the reality is that I think they're well-paced. I think they're necessary, but I do know there's not as much action within them as I'm sure some people would like. But trust me, you need the build-up. It's part of the pacing. The other thing, because this is my first action-oriented book, and I was actually talking to my husband about this morning, about my first book versus this book, and how I'm in some ways learned a new writing technique. And we were talking about how, like, first things first, you have to learn to write a book. And so the best way to do that is to write to your strength. So my strength happens to be dialogue and character. I have always been good at that. And my biggest weakness is probably prose, but we can get into prose later. But essentially, the Chaos Child, because when the video that just came out, I talked about how, like, I'm not embarrassed by it, but it's not really what I want it to be anymore. And he was kind of, like, reassuring me, telling me, like, but that's the point. You needed to learn how to write a book. You couldn't do these action set pieces when you're learning to write, else it would have been too messy, too jumbled, trying too much, and probably would have been a lot worse. And what's nice about To Private Ford Rayburn is that this was me being able to flex and learn how to write tension and action sequences. My husband pointed out, like, from here on out, you'll be more inclined to do that because you had to learn it. But you can't learn that on your first book if it's not your forte. And that's fine. I hope that every book I write improves on itself. I don't want to stagnate. And so this is where tension versus suspense, because part of the reason I never leaned into tension, I think I've had a lot of stories in my head that had a lot of, like, action set pieces that I would just kind of ignore or find a way to write out, and I was just never into it. And I never understood why that was, because, like, I love pulpy stories when I could find them. Not Conan the Barbarian. I have my own feelings about that, but but I do like a good pulp story. And the thing is that most of the time when I would read an action adventure book, it wasn't so much that it was like action and tension, it was suspense. And I cannot stand suspense. And I thought, okay, so I'm just not gonna write suspense, right? And then I wrote To Private Ford Rayburn, and I'm like, there's a lot of suspense. I mean, it's not like big suspense. You kind of know what's going to happen, but it's still there. And I realized it's not suspense, though. It's tension. And what is happening is a lot of people are mistaking tension for suspense, or suspense for tension. And so what I realized is the problem is that suspense, most of the time, so suspense, I almost want to, like, paint it with a broad brush, but I do think there is space for suspense in stories, and there are some really great stories I've read that were very suspenseful. However, they always made me feel very tense. Yes. And that's because half the time the suspense was playing on my emotions, and it was manipulating my emotions instead of the story naturally having that suspense. So a good book that comes to mind is The Secret of Platform 13 by Eva Ibbotson. I talked about it with the Harry Potter, when I talked about Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling heavily ripped off from it. It is a very suspenseful book. And I reread it this past summer, and actually a friend of mine read it this summer, and we both did something very interesting, which is we skipped the middle of the book and just went to the ending. And we were talking about it later, and she was like, yeah, I kind of just got annoyed that I knew where it was going, but that build-up was starting to really get to me, so I just kind of finished it, right? And avoided the build-up. And I was like, yeah, that was the same thing. And it was weird because, like, you could, like, skip a huge chunk of the middle, and it didn't change the story because you knew what the outcome of the story was. And I realized it was because there was one part of that book which was, there was one character who had all the information, and the writer artificially made it so she couldn't communicate it to the other characters in time. So essentially, you had to go for the whole book until at the very last second, the characters would get all the information they needed, and then you could have your finale. And I was realizing that's what it was. It was things like that. That's what tend to happen in suspense books, where it was something where you felt like, look, if a character just had this information, then none of this plot would happen. And I realized that was the difference when I was writing my books, or when I write my books, is I always work off of the, okay, how much information could these characters potentially have at any given moment? And if they don't have it, then the reader doesn't necessarily have it either. And it depends on what's going on. So like some of it is, you know, into Private Ford Rayburn you have one character on one side of the world and another character on the other side of the world, and so obviously they don't have the same information. But you, the reader, can piece it together, and you're watching them piece it together. But it's not this artificial thing of like, if they just knew, right? They kind of do know the essential parts. They just need to find the proof. And so it's like that. I'm okay with that, but I feel like most suspense books are, no, I'm going to artificially withhold the information from the character, and then I'm also going to artificially withhold it from the reader, to the point where I've even seen suspense books where they have to actively lie to the reader for their plot to happen. And that's where you get like the manipulation of emotions, because you'll read it and you'll be very excited and you'll be very aroused, not like that, but still aroused and anxious about what's going to happen, that you have to finish the book. And then you do finish the book, and in a good suspense story, it will be a satisfying conclusion. But I do feel like increasingly it's become A, dissatisfying, these conclusions, B, when you are constantly chasing that trend of heightened emotion in your reader, it gets old really fast. Actually, a good example of this is I remember reading the third book in Song of Ice and Fire series, George R. R. Martin, and I mean the Red Wedding, and then which immediately followed by the Purple Wedding. But after I had finished the Red Wedding, I remember like I threw the book across the room. I was so mad, and then I like quickly picked it up, read the last chapter, and if you've read the book, you know why. And that was the only way I could continue to read the book, because it was so infuriating. And then I noticed that it took me a lot longer to finish the fourth book. And then I almost didn't even finish the fifth book. It took me like a year. Not to even like get through it. It was like I read a chapter and it just sat on my bedside table for an entire year before I finally went, okay, I guess I'm reading it today. And I think it was because of the heightened emotions I had about the Red Wedding and how manipulated I felt in that moment that it spoiled the rest of the series. And then there's like other issues with the series, but in that moment I wasn't thinking about those things. I was just thinking like, whoa, that was intense, and it was satisfying, especially with the Purple Wedding that follows. But yet, if The Winds of Winter ever come out, I'm not going to read it. And it started with that. And like Harry Potter did something similar too, where like once I finished the series, I have never gone back to reread them. I mean, we're talking like 20 years ago now, right? Something like that. I have not touched them. I don't even want to watch the movies. I don't care. That's how much like you played with my emotions, and I don't care anymore. So what is tension then? tension is the natural buildup of something, the natural buildup of suspense and action and tension, right? So and that's the big difference when you're writing. So if it's a natural buildup, so if it's the characters themselves are in a tense situation and they are feeling tense, and you, the reader, can feel that coming across the page, that's a good thing. And that's more natural and more enjoyable to read because it shows, A, it's good writing, right? But B, it shows the character's emotional state and you can get invested and you're invested in what happens without being manipulated or lied to want to know what happens. And so yeah, I'm going to toot my own horn here, but I feel like I did that with Ford Rayburn. And the reason I did that, though, is because I don't like suspense novels, but I wanted to write an action novel. And one of the things about action stories is you do have a lot of tension and suspense. Like, you know, the Mexican standoff. 3 guys have got guns trained on each other. Who's going to come out of that alive? It's a very tense and suspenseful moment. But it is a moment, and then it's over. And it's the same thing, and that's what I tried to focus on in my story was it's a moment and then it's over. I did not linger on these things. I did not linger on these suspenseful, manipulative things like I almost did. That was in the first draft, the NaNoWriMo draft, and I'll talk about NaNoWriMo later this month. And that was something that my editor told me I needed to nix. It was, I wanted there to be like this really big reveal when we find out that Ray is alive, even though it's telegraphed super hard, obviously. And my editor's like, that's not interesting. Just write what he's been doing. And I realized, yeah, I was going to fall for that trap, mostly because I thought I didn't want to write action scenes, but also because I think it's easy to fall into the suspense trap for various reasons, because you kind of want to do these big impactful moments and you don't realize that like that's not it's not gonna work essentially. If you do the big impactful, you have to kind of like lie and manipulate your story. Always err on like, don't lie to your reader and don't fall for manipulation. Like one of the things that people have lately been getting annoyed at, before some other reasons, is the sudden villain. What the heck is that called? The twist villain, right? It was like interesting the first time, and then it gets old really fast and it gets annoying really fast. And the problem with that is that it's the same thing. So the first time is like, the first time you see it, it's like, oh, okay, interesting. And then every subsequent time it's like, stop it. Stop manipulating me into liking this guy just to like tell me they're an asshole, right? And I remember like watching Frozen, you know, the first time you watch it in theaters, and it was like, oh, that was great. And then another movie I've never seen again because I was talking about it with my husband and boyfriend at the time, and we were like, yeah, that was actually not that great. Because once we started like analyzing all of it, we went, why was Hans evil in that? Like these things didn't make any sense. And you realize it was because they were manipulating you into liking him just to pull the rug out from under you so they can go, what a twist! To quote that. So, don't do suspense. I mean, do suspense properly, but don't do manipulative suspense. Do tension.